At its peak, the Soviet Union did not look like a state preparing to die. It looked like a system built to outlast weather, leaders, even time itself. From the Baltic to the Pacific, it commanded 11 time zones, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, the largest land army on Earth, and an industrial map so vast it seemed less like an economy than geology. Steel mills burned through the night. Pipelines ran westward like arteries under snow and taiga. Tank factories in Nizhny Tagil, mines in the Donbas, oil fields in western Siberia, design bureaus around Moscow, grain ships crossing the Black Sea, and the red flag above the Kremlin all suggested the same thing. Scale was destiny. Even in 1990, by some measures, the Soviet economy still ranked second in the world. It could still put rockets into orbit, still negotiate arms treaties as Washington's only equal, still frighten Europe, still subsidize clients, still maintain the rituals of superpower confidence. To millions abroad, and to many at home, the Soviet state seemed too large to fail in any ordinary sense. Empires were invaded, defeated, partitioned. They did not simply stop being able to pay their bills. And yet, that is what makes the ending so unsettling. Because behind the parades, behind the military inventories, behind the language of historical necessity, there was a quieter erosion already underway. A fiscal machine that needed hard currency it could not reliably earn, a command system losing the ability to command, and a leadership trying to modernize without surrendering control. The last Soviet years were not just a political drama, they were a balance sheet drama. The Red Empire did not collapse only in the streets, or on television, or at the barricades around the White House in Moscow. It also collapsed in ledgers, in export earnings, in deficits, in vanished reserves, in the narrowing distance between a superpower and a debtor. That is the part simplified retellings often flatten. They show the flag coming down. They show the coup. They show Boris Yeltsin on the tank. They rarely show the cash drawer already emptying in the back room. There's a moment that catches this whole story in miniature. In 1990, at the Houston G7 summit, Mikhail Gorbachev came to the leaders of the capitalist world not as a conqueror, not as a revolutionary tribune, but as the head of a wounded financial system seeking relief. The National Security Archive notes that the summit turned down Gorbachev's request for financial aid, and just before it, he had written asking for long-term credit assistance and the attraction of foreign financing. That phrase matters. Credit assistance? It sounds technocratic, almost bloodless. But inside those two words was the confession of an entire century. This was the state that had promised autonomy from capitalism, insulation from world markets, immunity from bourgeois cycles. Now its leader was effectively telling the West that the Soviet economy needed breathing room, needed trust, needed time, needed money. Not ammunition, not ideology, money. So the question is not simply why the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991. The more unsettling question is how a regime built on coercion, sacrifice, and enormous physical resources reached the point where its survival depended on external credit and shrinking reserves. What had happened in the decades before the coup, before the republics peeled away, before the final Christmas speech? What turned apparent geopolitical mass into financial fragility? How did a superpower become solvent only by grace, delay, and denial? The numbers begin answering long before the politicians do. One of the most useful corrections comes from economic historians who insist that collapse was not a single event in 1991, but a cumulative loss of margin. The command economy had always been inefficient, but inefficiency is not the same as immediate death. As Mark Harrison argues, the Soviet system could sustain a stable high-output equilibrium, so long as coercion, compliance, and the state's reputation for enforcing both still held. Stephen Kotkin, in a different register, has also stressed that the Soviet fall was less a lightning strike than the culmination of long-running structural failures. By the mid-1980s, those failures were colliding with external realities the system was badly equipped to absorb. The World Bank's 1990 assessment described a state whose fiscal deficit rose from around 2.5% of GDP in 1985 to more than 8.5% by 1987, reaching 11% in 1988 on an adjusted basis, while the old planning system had broken down without a functioning market replacing it. That phrase is devastating. Broken down, not dismantled. The machine was no longer doing its old job, but the new machine did not yet exist. Meanwhile, oil, one of the Soviet Union's crucial sources of hard currency earnings, turned from lifeline to trap. Britannica notes the plunge in oil. Prices from roughly $120 a barrel in 1980 to 24 in March 1986. The World Bank report likewise points to the sharp decline in world oil prices in 1986, and again in 1988, as direct blows to export earnings and the budget. When a state depends on selling commodities for the hard currency required to buy food, machinery, and imported technology, an oil shock is not just a bad quarter. It is a political event in disguise. Then came the global price of borrowing. The Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies describes the collapse of state socialism as a toxic mix of unfavorable global conditions, structural flaws inside command economies, and policy blunders by socialist leaders. Its figures are brutal. The U.S. federal funds rate rose from around 5% in 1907 to 90% in 1981. Borrowing costs for socialist states that had once been around 6% in the 1970s rose toward 19% by 1981. For countries with weak convertible export capacity, that was suffocation by arithmetic. Socialist economies were industrial on paper, but many of their goods were not competitive in world markets. They could make turbines, tractors, machine tools, and armored vehicles in volume, but volume did not automatically convert into internationally useful revenue. The Soviet sphere had size. What it lacked was flexible access to hard currency under pressure. Add to that declining investment growth, technological backwardness, and the political need to keep subsidizing prices and employment, and the numbers stop looking cyclical. They start looking terminal. By late 1991, according to a New York Times report, official Russian estimates placed Soviet hard currency debts to governments, banks, and private businesses around $80 billion. Even if one chooses lower net figures from other estimates, the direction is obvious. The state had become financially exposed at exactly the moment its internal authority was fraying. And because the system was trying to preserve social peace, it resorted more and more to monetary softness and fiscal evasion. Britannica notes that perestroika often kept bureaucratic structures in place even while loosening parts of the price system, giving the country, in effect, the disadvantages of both planning and markets. Not enough discipline to remain a command economy, not enough freedom to become a real one, the worst of both worlds, and still the burden spread wider. Military spending remained politically difficult to cut, even as civilian scarcity worsened. Britannica is blunt on this point. Soviet military spending was largely insulated from overall economic trends, while technical talent that might have supported a market transition was instead absorbed into defense industries. Afghanistan deepened the strain. It was not simply the direct cost of the war from 1979 to 1989, though that mattered. It was the reputational cost, the demonstration effect, the creeping visibility of limits. Chernobyl did something similar in a different key. Gorbachev himself later suggested that the disaster may have been even more important than perestroika in causing the collapse, because it stripped the state of credibility. Credibility is one of those words historians use that sounds abstract until one notices how many systems run on it. A bank runs on credibility. A currency runs on credibility. A rationing system runs on credibility. An empire that says tomorrow will be disciplined, supplied, and under control also runs on credibility. Once that weakens, every Q becomes a referendum. Harrison's insight about reputation is worth dwelling on here. The Soviet command system was not merely an administrative structure. It was a bargain, brutal but legible. Obey, work, endure, and the center will continue to coordinate, punish, reward, and provide. If the center can no longer punish consistently, or no longer provide reliably, the bargain becomes a rumor. By 1989, the strike movement exposed exactly that. And once workers, managers, republic leaders, and citizens all begin adjusting behavior to the expectation that the old center may delete, they become rational participants in breakdown. Hoarding makes sense. Barter makes sense. Concealing output makes sense. Breaking ranks makes sense. Suddenly, the system's official language survives, longer than the actual system it describes. To understand why Mikhail Gorbachev became the face of this contradiction, it helps to remember that he did not emerge from some dissident fringe. He was a product of the system at its most aspirational. Britannica and the Nobel biography both trace him back to a farming background in Stavropol, to adolescent work driving a combine harvester, to early distinction as a disciplined, upwardly mobile Soviet success story, and then to Moscow State University law. He was not born to dismantle the machine. He was trained to rescue it. That is what gives his career its tragic shape. He had seen enough of Soviet life to understand stagnation, waste, fear, and ritualized lying, but he also rose high enough to believe the state could be morally and administratively renewed. Margaret Thatcher famously said, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." The CIA, early in his rule, called him the new broom. And for a while that assessment felt almost inadequate to the scale of expectation attached to him. Here was a younger leader after the gerontocracy, articulate, energetic, less embalmed than his predecessors in every sense. He did not want to liquidate Soviet power. He wanted to modernize it, humanize it, and keep it intact. That matters because it explains why his reforms were simultaneously bold and timid. He introduced openness, but feared the consequences of full loss of control. He loosened the old command hierarchy, but recoiled from the social shock of full market transition. He wanted public truth without total institutional collapse, enterprise reform without mass unemployment, decentralization without disunion, diplomacy abroad and stability at home. In plain language, he wanted a softer empire that still remained an empire. History is often unkind to that category of leader. By 1990, those contradictions had to be argued out in rooms rather than slogans. One of the clearest episodes came with the 500 Days Plan, developed by reform economists around Stanislav Shatlin and associated with Grigory Yavlinsky. The plan was radical by Soviet standards. Price liberalization, wage restraint, deep subsidy cuts. privatization, tax overhaul, banking reform, foreign trade liberalization, and a path toward a convertible ruble. It was, in other words, an attempt to create quickly what the old system had never allowed to exist. But Soviet history at Michigan State notes the political poison buried inside the economics. The plan also shifted immense autonomy toward the republics. It implied not just market reform, but a rebalancing of power away from the Union center. Gorbachev hesitated. Nikolai Ryzhkov and others pushed a slower, more controlled alternative. One can almost hear the fear behind the bureaucratic prose. Move too fast and prices explode, savings evaporate, and citizens who have tolerated queues may not tolerate chaos. Move too slowly and the old system continues to disintegrate while the new one never arrives. This is the decision seen at the heart of late Soviet collapse. And it is more dramatic for being so administrative. No one needed to shout. Everyone in that room already knew the country was running out of time. Western loans were needed to keep the economy solvent. Subsidies had made daily life barely bearable. Remove them, and the social contract could rupture instantly. Keep them, and the fiscal math deteriorated further. The terrifying thing about true state failure is that by the time it becomes visible to the public, many of the elite choices are already between two bad outcomes. Gorbachev ultimately rejected the full-speed version and backed something more timid. That hesitation is not the whole story. But it is one of the clearest moments when reform acknowledged necessity and then flinched before its own implications. While this was unfolding at the top, a second thread was pulling the Union apart from below and from the side. It seemed at first like a separate story. Not budgets, but sovereignty. Not credit, but legitimacy. The more glasnost widened public speech, the more republics and regional elites began to talk in a language the center could not easily answer. The Baltic states demanded independence. The Caucasus pressed old grievances into open politics. Russia itself, under Boris Yeltsin, increasingly behaved less like the core republic of the Soviet state and more like a rival claimant to authority. The State Department's chronology captures the political sequence well. Democratization destabilized communist control. The split between Yeltsin and Gorbachev widened after the May 1990 elections. By 1991, Washington was already weighing whether to support Gorbachev, shift toward the republics, or try to leverage aid against deeper reform. But the economic underside of this sovereignty struggle is just as important. As the World Bank report noted, open ethnic conflict and rising nationalist assertion were disrupting output and transport. Once Republic leaders concluded that Moscow's extraction might no longer be matched by dependable provision, keeping resources local became rational politics. Control over tax flows, enterprise output, and commodity revenues stopped being a technocratic issue and became a survival issue. A union held together by command can endure a surprising amount of resentment if the command still works. Once it stops working, every warehouse becomes political. Every rail bottleneck becomes an accusation. Every delayed shipment feels less like inefficiency than exploitation. In that world, Yeltsin's rise was not just ideological. It was institutional. He could position himself as the figure closer to Russian resources, Russian legitimacy, and Russian impatience with a union center that still made demands while losing the ability to fulfill them. So while Gorbachev was trying to refinance and redesign the Soviet house, another tenant was measuring the walls for partition. The two dramas looked separate. They were not. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The Soviet leadership was trying to preserve the Union by loosening coercion, but the command economy itself had depended on coercion, hierarchy, and credibility. Harrison's formulation is severe and elegant. The regime's reputation was fragile. A stumble could weaken it, and a major slip could destroy it. Gorbachev's reforms were meant to save the state by reducing fear and introducing responsiveness. Instead, they partly removed the enforcement logic before a replacement coordination mechanism existed. A former Soviet official, quoted by Harrison through William Keegan, put it with devastating simplicity. "We used to work in a centrally controlled system where they told you what to produce. Now they've stopped telling us what to produce, so we don't produce anything." That is not a joke, though it sounds like one. It is the obituary of half reform. The contradiction ran deeper still. The West admired Gorbachev for ending the Cold War, allowing Eastern Europe to break free and declining large-scale violence. Helmut Kohl credited his policies for the transformations of 1999, François. Mitterrand complained that the West was too timid in helping the USSR, yet every diplomatic success abroad could sharpen vulnerability at home. Concessions that improved Soviet relations with the outside world also weakened the mythology of encirclement that had justified sacrifice inside the system. Reduced fear abroad did not automatically create solvency at home. Nonviolence increased moral legitimacy in Paris and Washington, but it also signaled to hardliners, nationalists, and striking workers that the center might not repress as it once had. The same reform that made Gorbachev admirable to the world made him less terrifying to the machine that had built Soviet order. And a command system that ceases to terrify without learning how to price, contract, supply, borrow, and tax like a normal state enters a dangerous middle zone. Not dictatorship enough to enforce. Not market enough to adapt, not federation enough to negotiate, not nation-state enough to consolidate, just a giant, trembling interim. By the final year, the evidence of depletion was no longer theoretical. It sat in reserves, in debt talks and emergency measures and public panic. The Christian Science Monitor reported in October 1991 that Soviet gold reserves had fallen to 240 tons, worth roughly $2.5 billion, and that 135 tons had been sold since January 1st to pay for essential imports and foreign debt obligations. Grigory Konin described the decline as part of a broader economic descent since 1986. Gold is not everything, but in a system with a non-convertible currency, it becomes an unusually revealing barometer. If even the metal is leaving the vault to buy time, time itself has become one of the state's scarcest assets. Meanwhile, the effort to preserve order through improvisation only deepened disorder. There were attempts at tighter monetary controls, hesitation over prices, continuing subsidy dilemmas, and a growing sense among citizens that paper promises were safer spent than saved. Long before the flag came down, ordinary life had already become a referendum on the credibility of the ruble. The World Bank had warned that the old planning system had broken down while market structures were still absent. Soviet history notes how commerce devolved toward barter among enterprises, cities, and regions. Shortages of tea, soap, meat, bread, and cigarettes acquired the moral force of daily humiliation. The August 1991 coup then delivered the political shock that exposed how little authority remained in the center. The State Department's account is clear. The failed hardline coup sealed the fate of the Soviet Union, diminished Gorbachev's power, and thrust Yeltsin to the forefront. But by then, the coup was less the origin than the detonation. Ukraine and Belarus declared independence soon after. The Baltic states sought recognition. In December, Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus formed the Commonwealth of Independent States, effectively announcing that the Soviet Union was over before the ceremony fully caught up. On December 25th, the hammer and sickle came down over the Kremlin. The image remains famous because it is cinematic. The truer horror is that symbols often stay upright longer than the financial and administrative capacities beneath them. And the cost did not end with the lowering of a flag. It arrived in arrears, dislocation, and a decade of institutional trauma. The post-Soviet recession was catastrophic. Mark Harrison points to the vast output collapse around the transition years. Later, analyses note that the inherited Soviet and early Russian budget crisis of 1991 reached extraordinary levels and had to be financed by money creation. The debt issue did not vanish with the Union. Russia eventually assumed responsibility for much of the Soviet external debt, a decision that bought continuity with creditors at the price of inheriting the dead empire's bills. Factories tied to all Union supply chains lost customers and inputs at once. Military industries shed the protective logic that had insulated them. Savings were mauled in the inflationary chaos that followed. Crime surged into markets where law arrived late. Oligarchic privatization, whatever its long-term defenders say, did not feel to most citizens like clean modernization. It felt like salvage by the fast and the connected. Beyond Russia, the dissolution left frozen conflicts, border disputes, nuclear command anxieties, and state-building crises across the former Soviet space. The United States, as its own historical office records, prioritized preventing nuclear catastrophe and managing a peaceful transition precisely because the arsenal of the fallen Union was so enormous. So when people speak of the Soviet collapse as peaceful, that description needs handling with gloves. It was peaceful compared with some imperial disintegrations. It was not peaceful in the intimate economic sense. It pulverized expectations, careers, savings, and biographical continuity for millions. A miner, an engineer, a provincial party manager, a pensioner, a shop clerk, a tank designer, a schoolteacher, each discovered in different ways that the world under their feet had been less solid than advertised. The old joke about pretending to work while the state pretended to pay acquired a darker sequel. Eventually, the state stopped pretending effectively enough, and whole lives were repriced. I want to be careful here, because this is where bad history usually becomes very confident. It is tempting to compress everything into a conspiracy, an oil plot, a CIA victory lap, a single traitor, a single naive reformer, or one decisive meeting in a foreign capital. That is not good enough. The serious historians are more disciplined than that. The evidence points not to one cause, but to interacting causes. Long stagnation, low competitiveness, dependence on hard currency commodity earnings, rising borrowing costs, military burden, administrative decay, nationalities conflict, reform contradictions, Chernobyl's blow to legitimacy, Afghanistan's corrosive example, and the fatal politics of trying to soften coercion before building functioning alternatives. The Vienna Institute's phrase, toxic mix, is useful precisely because it denies the comfort of monocausality. Harrison complicates the story further by arguing the command system was not simply doomed from birth. It could remain stable for long periods, then break when the costs of maintaining compliance rose and the regime's reputation cracked. Even Gorbachev's own role must be handled with some fairness. He did not set out to liquidate the Soviet state. He tried to rescue it from sclerosis. The tragedy is that rescue, under those conditions, may have been structurally more dangerous than continued repression. That does not make him either villain or saint. It makes him one of history's more consequential surgeons, operating after the patient had already begun to bleed internally. What historians get wrong, more precisely, what popular retellings get wrong, is the timing of the death. They place it too late. They point to August 1991, or Christmas 1991, or the Berlin Wall, and mistake the visible collapse for the true origin. But the origin was earlier and colder. It lived in a state that had mastered scale without mastering flexibility, in an empire that could command output but struggled to generate competitive value, in a superpower that treated oil windfalls as structural strength, in a system that let coercion decay before a new economic grammar existed to replace it. Empires usually imagine they fall to enemies. Sometimes they fall to invoices, to mismatched incentives, to promises that can no longer be funded, to the loss of faith that tomorrow's train, wage, shipment, and order will arrive because the center said they would. That is the darker lesson here. Power can survive inefficiency for decades. It can survive hypocrisy longer than moralists like to admit. What it cannot survive indefinitely is the erosion of belief inside its own operating code. Once the ministries stop believing, the managers stop believing, the workers stop believing, the republics stop believing, and the creditors stop believing, flags become fabric. Nothing more. If that unsettles you, it should. Because every large system tells the same bedtime story in its own accent. That scale is safety, that complexity is control, that there will always be one more reserve to sell, one more delay to negotiate, one more reform to buy legitimacy without surrendering power. Usually there isn't. If the word that stays with you after this is solvency, leave it in the comments. It is not a romantic word. That is why it matters. And if you want more financial histories of empires, collapses, and the quiet math beneath public power, stay with this channel. The loud part of history gets most of the attention. The ledger usually gets the last word.